Good afternoon. I'm Ruth Penfold-Mounts and I'm from the University of York. Forgive me for reading from my phone. I forgot to actually do a printout, but it's more eco-friendly, I think, to read from here. And today I'm going to be chairing this session on This Mortal Coil, A History of Death. And it's my great pleasure that this is in person today. And before I introduce you to the speaker, I want to draw your attention to the evacuation slide up on the screen. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the steward's instructions and evacuate the venue via the nearest available exit. Please, can I also encourage you to put your phones on silent for this session. So let me introduce to you our speaker for this afternoon. Andrew is a professor of biochemistry at the University of Manchester, and he's been based at the University of Manchester since 1994. His research is on computational biology, neuroscience, dementia, developmental biology, and proteins. And we're delighted that Andrew's joining us to talk about his first book, This Mortal Coil, which I'm waving at you right here. It provides an eye-opening portrait of death throughout history, looking at particular causes, from infection to genetic disease, violence to diet, who this has affected, and the people who's made it possible to overcome some of these issues. So without further ado, please allow me to hand over to Andrew to share his exciting and potentially grim findings with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and especially thank you all for coming along today. So I'm going to tell you about the history of death, or more specifically, causes of death and why they've changed so much in time. Or in other words, we're going to look at the entire history of humankind over the last 10,000 years in about 40 minutes. So let's go. So the story starts in 1592, and in 1592, plague came to London, as it had done for over the previous few hundred years. But in 1592, the Lord Mayor of London issued a new law, and he said, in every parish there shall be appointed 2 sober ancient women, which are in practice widows, to be sworn to be viewers of the bodies of such as shall die in times of infection. And what their job was to take, if anybody died in their parish, they were to inspect the body and record whether they died of plague or not. And here's a picture of them. The searchers are the 2 women at the front, and they're holding these long red sticks so that people could avoid them, because they were spreading disease, right? And they were shunned. And appropriately, there's a coffin behind them. So it was their job to view bodies and decide whether they'd died of plague or not, because the Lord Mayor wanted to know whether there was a new plague epidemic coming along. And for instance, if the numbers of plague cases got too high, they would do things like close the theatres to stop infection. You know, much the same as we do social distancing and things like that today with COVID. So what I'll show you next is the classification scheme that these searchers used when they assigned a cause of death to a body. And don't worry, I'll take you through the scheme slowly. That's it. Because all they cared about initially was whether they were dying of plague, right? And they used this system for about 40 years, and then it was decided that the lower category could be broadened out a little, and they started to record actually what people died from. And they would pull them together, and they would publish every week these things called bills of mortality. And I'll show you an example from one week in February 1664, and this is what it looks like. So these are the diseases and casualties this week. It's a bit small, let me blow up some of it. This is the start of epidemiology. So we record what everybody died from across the entire world with these rigid classifications restored by the World Health Organization. It all started like this. So if we blow it up, we can see that 393 people died that week in London, half men, half women. Nobody died of plague, so that was a good week. If we jump ahead a year and a half, September 1665, look now, we now have 7,690 dying in that week instead of 300 and something. And you can see that most of them are dying of plague. So the plague was at its height raging here, and that's what they were keeping track of. Every cloud has a silver lining. A plague outbreak was a nice little earner for the searchers because they were paid per corpse. So that's plague. Let's take a look at what else people died from back then. So the main cause of death back then was infectious disease. So we had at the top consumption, 129 died from consumption. This is tuberculosis. 333 died from fever, which is presumably some kind of infectious disease. 97 died from spotted fever. This is like fever, but it comes with spots. King's evil is another type of tuberculosis. Rising of the lights. Lights means your lungs, and this is a rather poetic way of coughing up blood, which would kill you. Many of these are childhood diseases. This is not entirely obvious. A chrysome is a child who's maybe in the first few weeks of life and then they died. An infant might be 3 to 6 months. Teeth, they didn't die from tooth decay. They died when they were teething, so they were maybe like 1 year, 18 months, something like that. And 39 died of childbed. This is women dying in childbirth, which we'll come back to. And there's some other strange ones here. You can die of being frighted. You can die of lethargy, grief. Somebody died of planets. This is death by astrology. So they died because they were a Virgo and Jupiter was in Sagittarius or something like that. I don't know what the symptoms were, but the searchers recognised this as a cause of death. And there's all sorts of strange ones there. You could die from trouble and oppression. Suddenly. As well as rising of the lights, you could have sinking of the spirits. You could die by sighing. You could be distracted. Maybe you wandered in front of a horse and cart, I don't know. Melancholia. Overlaid. So overlaid, what this means is this is another dead baby, and what the mother said, the baby was sleeping next to me, I rolled over in the night and suffocated my child and the child died. This is probably actually infanticide. This is probably babies that were deliberately smothered, and this is the story they told the searchers to avoid being convicted of a crime. And Spanish disease, this is just being rude to the Spanish, frankly. This is syphilis. But what interested me is this. One case, in all of London that week, just one person died of cancer, apparently. And nobody died of heart attacks, stroke, or dementia. So what's going on? This is the question I set out to answer, right? Why is this? Why were causes of death in the past so different to what we see today? And that's what we'll look at, okay? So what I'm going to go through is different causes of death and see why we don't die from these things anymore and what we die of now and why. So that's the basis of the book and the talk and everything else, okay? But this is what originally intrigued me was these bills of mortality. Number one cause of death is violence. So most of human history, we weren't living in cities and we weren't doing farming. We were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and it was a violent world. If we look at skeletons back there, we see this. That's an arrowhead in a bone. These are the results of massacres. These people have all been killed with weapons because we see skulls like these. Right? And this is really common. Maybe 1 in 6 people were killed by other people when we were hunter-gatherers, which is way, way higher than the death rate from violence these days. And these people were hunting wild animals, which is also a dangerous occupation. So they were dying from infectious disease, but less so than when we were living in cities. And there was a lot of infanticide. If you're nomadic, if you couldn't feed your baby or carry your baby, then they were frequently killed as well. You might wait for the child to be 3 when they could walk a decent distance by themselves before you could have another baby, right? Now, we dealt with violence when we started living in cities through the invention of law, and this is one of the oldest law codes. This is from the Emperor Hammurabi, who lived in Babylon in Iraq nearly 4,000 years ago. And on the left, this is a big stone tablet. At the top, he's receiving the law from the god Shamash, and underneath it, there's a blow-up here, and that's writing, and we can read this. And it has hundreds of laws on it, like this. If a man damages the eye of another man, then the culprit shall have his eye destroyed. And if a person breaks another man's bone, the bone of the culprit shall be broken. This might resemble an eye for an eye, a tooth for the tooth, because the law in the Bible was written in the same place 1,000 years later, and maybe this influenced it. So violence was now illegal. So before, if they didn't have laws, it wasn't really illegal. And at the bottom, Hammurabi said his aim is to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so the strong should not harm the weak. So previously, if you were, beaten up and robbed or something like that, what could you do about it? You might have friends and family who could take revenge, but if you didn't, what could you do? But now, if you were a victim of injustice, the king was on your side, and the king would administer justice on the behalf of all victims, right? This is really important. So the state was stepping in, saying, don't take revenge, we will get you justice for you, and we will protect everybody in the kingdom. Another thing that happened when we started living in states is we had professional soldiers. So previously, if your group was attacked, maybe all the young men would have to pick up a weapon and do some fighting. But if you had empires, then the job was left up to professionals who had armor and horses and swords and training, and they would do the fighting for you, like we see here again from one of the first states in Iraq. We've got soldiers on the left, and on the right, Chinese soldiers from the famous Terracotta Army. So the result was this: benevolent, well-run states gave us a huge decline in violence, and so there's far less violence when we started living in states compared to the Paleolithic. So there's a cause of death that's really plummeted. The next thing we looked at was famine. So the edge of hunger, again, when we're living in states and doing farming and having staple crops, is the normal condition of mankind. So the population of humans in a particular place would generally be hovering around the maximum possible with the amount of food that you produce. So if you have a good harvest, the babies all survive, but that just means more mouths to feed next year. And then if you have a bad harvest, people are going to starve and there's going to be famine. And even in famine, the normal cause of death during a famine isn't actually starvation, it's infectious disease, where people are weak and hungry and eat bad things that they shouldn't be eating and get sick and die. This is a survey. This is a map of famines in Europe from the year 1250 to the present day. And each of these lines is when we had a famine, and the red are the particularly bad ones. And you can see they're just, the population grows, and then you have a famine, and the population crashes down. Like the red one here, like 20% of people died in 1315, for instance. So a couple of other features of this. You might note on the right, you can see even in the last 200 years, there are famines, less so. I'll come back to that. But things don't seem to be too bad for this period of 200 years from about 1350, right? And that's because of the Black Death, where 1 in 3 people died. And then that meant there was a lot more farmland for each of the survivors. So there was enough food, roughly, for 200 years. Then the population grew, and by the time you got to 1550, it was back to normal, with famines controlling the population. So how did we deal with this? The first country to beat famine in Europe was 17th century Netherlands, and this is what they did. They had lots of trade and transport. So if they had a harvest failure, they could bring in food from elsewhere on their excellent ships, and they had the money from trade to be able to do this. Land reclamation, producing more farmland. People started deliberately trying to breed better quality animals and better crops, and they would exchange these. And these giant vegetable competitions might seem quite amusing, but they're a really good way of spreading best practice and sharing the best seeds and the best animals and things like this. So agriculture improved. New crops came in from the Americas. Tomatoes, and looking at these, they're just so basic to our diet, it's hard to imagine how we lived without chocolate, but we did. And emigration. So this is the Dutch Empire, so millions of people left the Netherlands and went elsewhere. And now, in the Netherlands, and then it followed up by Britain, food production was now growing faster than the human population. So famine disappeared. Better nutrition, and particularly for children, meant people grew up bigger and stronger. They could work longer to get a positive cycle, produce more food, and they're better able to fight off disease. We do have famines. In modern famines are not caused by harvest failures, they're caused by politicians. Somewhat topically, this man here decided to starve the people of Ukraine in 1932, and 3.5 million died. It wasn't lack of food in the Soviet Union that meant that happened, it was the decision of Stalin. This is the worst famine in recent decades. This was in North Korea. They had harvest failure. Kim Jong-il kept this secret. It was a closed country, no food imports that could help, and this is still a bit of a mystery. Maybe 600,000 died. The worst famine of all time in terms of number of deaths is caused by this man, the Great Leap Forward famine in China in 1959, 30 million died. And famine is sometimes an instrument of war. In the First World War, we decided to blockade all food imports to Germany. Winston Churchill was head of the Navy at that time, and responsible for that decision. 500,000 German civilians starved to death. 1919 is not a typo. I know the war ended in 1918, but we maintained the blockade for 8 months to force the Germans to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and another 100,000 Germans died during that time. So there's no need to have famine anymore. We have enough food to feed the world, and if it happens, it's because of politicians and war and terrible decisions and poor governments and things like that. But we're doing really well with famine. So disasters make the news, good news doesn't. This is the death rate from famines from about, the 1860s. And look how well we're doing in recent decades, since the 1980s. Death rate from famine is less than 10% of what it was 50 years ago. We're doing really well with this, okay, even though there's more people around than ever. And these successes are just not appreciated, but this is a triumph. I know not everything's perfect, and there are problems in places like Sudan and Yemen and Ukraine and so on, but the overall big picture, we're doing very well. So death from famine is now rare. Harvest failures shouldn't cause famine if we help each other. If politicians blow the whistle and say, oh, we've got a problem here, unlike North Korea, then we can step in and help them. For instance, we have things like this. This is a famine early warning systems network, and shows where there's worries about food across the planet. And this was a couple of months, January, this is the situation. So you can see parts of Ethiopia and Yemen are most worrying, war zones basically. Okay, another cause of death from the past that we've largely defeated is childbirth. We are apes that walk upright. We have difficulty giving birth. The baby's likely to be stuck in the birth canal. And the traditional solution to this was, well, you could do a caesarean section. And this happened. The name Julius Caesar was supposedly born with a caesarean section, which is where the name comes from. Inevitably, the mother is going to die, but the alternative would be the mother and the baby die. So they did this. Or alternatively, you could kill the baby. Midwives had a gadget called a crochet, which they would stick in the birth canal, crush the baby's head, cut the baby's body into pieces, then pull the bits out. And that would save the mother's life. And this happened. A great solution to this was the invention of the forceps. This is one of our greatest inventions of all time, invented in the 16th century by the Chamberlain family. And disgracefully, they kept it secret for 100 years. This was their business. So what would happen? There would be a rich woman was struggling to give birth, so they would call out the Chamberlain family. And they went to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret that they had forceps. They'd show up with these carts with a massive box on it, which they'd carry in, and they'd pretend they got some huge piece of machinery in there. They'd blindfold the poor mother. They'd lock the door, and they'd ring bells and make all these noises and things as if they were using a machine. And anyway, in the meantime, they'd use the forceps, get the baby out, pack away all their gear, present the baby to the mother, and whip off the blindfold and take the cash. And this is their business. And the secret leaked out, and once they'd done that, death rate from childbirth halved because of the invention of forceps, one of the greatest inventions. Another problem is childbed fever, which I mentioned briefly. In 17th century Europe, doctors had another terrible idea, which was the creation of maternity hospitals. So instead of the midwife coming to your home and help you give birth, you'd go to a maternity hospital, and these were rife with infection. Up to 1 in 4 mothers would die in some of these hospitals. I'll show you some data here. So this is the chances of dying from childbed fever. So this is an infection you pick up after you gave birth. Bacterial infection, get sick, die a few weeks later. And you can see the dark blue, that's the death rate in Dublin maternity hospitals from 1784. You can see it's about 1%. And then in Vienna, you can see it leaps up. And what happened was, in the hospital, they were doing autopsies, and doctors would go and handle dead bodies, and then without washing their hands, they'd go and deliver babies. And they'd go from mother to mother, never washing their hands. They were wearing blood-soaked wooden leather aprons, and they'd spread infection around. And they had no idea that they were doing this. Until Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna realised that this is what was happening. And you can see the death rate was 5 to 10%. And if you think that women might be, have 10 babies, the chances of surviving going into one of these maternity hospitals were not that high. And the women in Vienna knew this. They tried to give birth in the street rather than go into these death traps. Anyway, Semmelweis got doctors to wash their hands, which is what happened here. And then if you look at the pink line, you can see that the death rate dropped down to the Dublin level. So we've mostly dealt with childbirth. Death in childbirth is now thankfully very rare, thanks to these measures. But the death in childbirth is now rare. And this is an illustration of the importance of washing and cleanliness, and the realization that disease is spread by germs, and if you wash, you can simply kill the germs and stop spreading disease, as shown by this childbed fever example. And cleanliness is next to godliness. That's the Victorian slogan to encourage people to wash. And they were doing, this is Victorian advert, encouraging people to have baths. And the Victorians were terrible doctors, but they could build, and they could build sewage systems, which we still use today, and provide clean water and things like this. And this is tremendously important in fighting infectious disease. Women could survive caesarean sections and other operations thanks to anaesthetics. And what he's spraying here is antiseptics to kill germs as well. Again, this cleanliness idea. Still not wearing gloves, I know, anyway. And life expectancy went up to 50-ish in late Victorian times thanks to these measures. Let's look at one example from Liverpool, how they dealt with this kind of thing. In 1700, Liverpool was not a large town, population 4,000, and then it exploded when they built new docks, and Liverpool got rich from slavery and sugar. And the population soared, and people were living in slum housing. One important thing was the first public wash house. So houses, and they had no way of washing people's clothing until public wash houses opened. The first one was by Kitty Wilkinson, and that was her business. And these things are really important to provide clean clothes. And there she is contemplating another load of washing. So in 1843, the population was 80,000, but then in 1847, the potato famine in Ireland, 300,000 starving, destitute people arrived from Dublin in Liverpool. And the public health situation got really bad, and Liverpool, to deal with this, they appointed Britain's first ever healthcare professional called William Duncan, a medical officer of health. So one person for all of Liverpool, or indeed all of Britain, not even that, it was actually a part-time post, firstly, to see whether it was actually worth having somebody doing this job. And he's commemorated in a pub in Liverpool. And this is what he found. Liverpool's the unhealthiest town in England. Life expectancy was just 17 for working class, which meant nearly all children died. 50 or 60 people could live in a four-room house. 20,000 people were living in the cellars of these houses, next to no sewers. They were living on flour dumplings and root vegetables, that was it. This is an example of this court housing. Back-to-back terraced houses. The last one of these was demolished in 1972. 3 stories. The cellars you can't see, they were often full of water and people lived in there anyway. At the front you can see a standpipe, which is the water supply. At the back is a privy, which 2 outside toilets emptying into buckets, which somebody had to empty, could be shared by 500 people. So the council took action. They started dealing with the worst slums, stopped people living in cellars. Dr. Duncan moved people out of cellars and bought out, rather than just the free market, the free market providing water, and if you wanted clean water you could pay for it, the council started providing it. Anyway, the point here is politicians were now taking responsibility for public health, which they hadn't done before. Kings hundreds of years ago, their main interests were law and order, maintaining justice and fighting. If you're fighting the Scots or the French basically, or both at the same time. That was their main interest, and they didn't really care about, it wasn't their responsibility to look after, the health of the people, but this changed. So answering half my question, why are causes of death in the past so different to those we see today, is that these are lots of things that we've basically dealt with, and this is how we did it. So not so many people die from violence because we have law and order, and the state stops it, police forces, right? The agricultural revolution has stopped famine. We don't die in childbirth anymore because of cleanliness and forceps and things like that. Plague I didn't mention, but plague led to the quarantine system, which again, we're using this with COVID as an ancient solution. You keep people away if you're infectious. Vaccination was invented 200 years ago for smallpox. The idea is you treat people with like a fragment of the thing that causes the disease, one of the proteins from a virus or some dead bacteria or something like that, and then your immune system will recognize that and it's able to fight off the real thing. Brilliant idea. Or drugs. We've only had, if you're sick, you go to the doctor, you kind of expect to be given some sort of chemical that make you better. We've only been doing this 100 years. This is a brilliant idea, the idea that you can take a chemical which is selectively toxic, right? It will kill the bacteria that are making you sick and it won't kill human cells. And that's the idea of drugs in a nutshell. That's a great idea, and that's what drug companies try to do. So these basic ideas were all understood 100 years ago, and they work. And we've mostly beaten infectious disease because of these measures. So we can do graphs like this. This is Massachusetts from the year 1840, and you can see in the 19th century, main cause of death was infectious disease, right? Always been the case. And then that big spike there in about 1920 is Spanish flu. We still have epidemics. New diseases are always going to arrive, right? But you've got to die from something. So you can see it was this huge switch 100 years ago in Western countries. This is absolute revolution in the way we live and die, in that heart disease, cancer took over from infectious diseases, our big killers. You may notice injuries have gone up a little bit as well. We'll take a look at that. So you've got to die from something. I'll tell you about 2 really bad inventions from the 20th century. Number 1 is, well, not just the cigarette, but this thing. This is a machine which will mass-produce cigarettes. So instead of being hand-produced, they're mass-produced cigarettes, and thanks to the power of the advertising industry, everybody started smoking. By 1950, most Americans were smoking, certainly most men. There are big jumps in wars because soldiers got free cigarettes in their ration packs, which got them all hooked. And we didn't realize at first that it would cause cancer, but you had to wait 30 years to find out, right? So everybody was hooked. Everybody's smoking by 1930, and lung cancer was only starting to take off then. So you get the health. So some of our biggest killers are for these reasons: cancer, heart attacks, respiratory disease. The other terrible invention is the car. This is one of the best-selling cars of all time from 1920. I'll take you through some of its lack of safety features. The driver here is sitting behind a plate glass windscreen like you got in the window of your house. He's also sitting behind a cast iron steering column. He's poised to be impaled on that. The brakes are rubbish. This is quite top heavy and it's likely to roll, so to protect his head he's wearing a hat. He's sitting on the fuel tank. There's no seat belts, turn signals, windscreen wipers and all the rest of these other gadgets that we expect and are indeed legal requirements. He hadn't taken a driving test, that's because there was no such thing. You just bought the car and away you went. He may well have been drunk, nobody cared if he was. The only good thing I can say about the Model T Ford is it could only do 45 miles an hour. Anyway, so you laugh at all these ridiculous things on the cars, but we don't have this in cars anymore, right? And we're better at designing roads, and the emergency services are better at dealing with accidents. And so the result of this, cars are 20 times safer per mile than they were 100 years ago, right? This is really good. This is still the leading cause of young men and of young people is traffic accidents and suicide. It's still, you know, these cars are still dangerous, obviously, but they're so much safer than they used to be. So if putting all this stuff together, we can see how life expectancy have improved. I'll show you France because we've got the best data. This is life expectancy in France for the last 200 years. You can see 200 years ago it was about 40. Men and women were much the same. And it's now 80-ish, or another way to... So you can see it started to rise about 150 years ago, right, when they started. Vaccines were invented and we started building sewage systems and things like that. Another way to think of it is life expectancy is increased by 6 hours per day. So you think every day you're 24 hours closer to death. No, you've got 6 hours back. Thanks to medicine, thanks to living in peace and having a better diet and all these other things we take for granted. And this is wonderful. And the best time ever to be alive is the 21st century, because life expectancy is now far higher than it's ever been at any point in human history. I know bad stuff happens and we get epidemics, and I'm aware of COVID and wars and things like this. I'm taking the really long-term, broad view here, but this is true. And there's some blips on this which we can mark here. You can see wars are bad for your health. Especially for men. You can see World War I, there's a big dip there, and that's only for men. So 1 million young French women were left without husbands. And then followed by Spanish flu, which you can see affected both, and so on. So you can see I've marked some bad things in red and some good things in green. Another way to look at it is survival curves. So this is UK data. People born, if you're born in 2016, you've got 100,000 people born in 2016, and this is your chances of staying alive to particular ages. And you can see it crosses 50,000 above the age of 80. So if you're born now, there's a greater than 50% chance to live to the age of 80, which is wonderful. And you can see hardly any children die, which is really good. Compare ancient Rome. Life expectancy in ancient Rome was 23 for men, 25 for women. And you can see you had a 50% chance of living to the age of 5, so half their babies died. And then there's a steady decline. You see, it doesn't go flat at any point. And what this shows is that whatever age you were, there was you could be hit by a deadly infectious disease at any point, right? That's why it goes like this. And your chances of living to be 70 are less than 10%. So ancient Rome must have been full of kids. And there were very few elderly people. So anyway, things are so much better. Babies don't die anymore. Well, some do. They always will. We'll still have some very premature babies born with genetic problems and so on, but things are so much better. Well, babies are not dying of infectious disease anymore. And I've shown UK and France, but these trends are happening across the entire world. So let's look at 3 countries. Japan is an affluent first world country. You can see in 1960, infant mortality was like 3% of babies died. Now it's 0.2%. Life expectancy has gone up to 84. Population's risen a bit. And if you know that your children are all going to live, people don't have so many babies. They have 1 or 2. And you can see the fertility rate, children per women, is only 1.4. And it has to be 2.1 to maintain the population. So the population of Japan is now falling. And all of Europe, the fertility rate is less than 2 now. And East Asia, it's less than 2. And North America. So world population is going to decline. Brazil, what happens is a thing called a demographic transition, where you go from lots of kids, like look at Brazil in 1960, 6.1 children per woman. So people would have many children because the death rate was really high, right? And then you go through this transition where if you're confident your children are going to live, you stop having babies. And compare Brazil 2017, 1.7, and life expectancy is up to 75. And Ethiopia, a typical African country, is going through the same transition. Look how its life expectancy has now jumped to 65.9. Fertility rate is falling. So, and the world is evening up. There's no massive difference between the first world and the third world anymore. And death from infectious diseases in steep decline everywhere. In Ethiopia, infectious disease is dropping fast. They all get vaccinated as well, same as everywhere else on the planet. And so cardiovascular and cancer take over. And so the world population is going to peak and then it's going to fall. So here's another way of looking at life expectancy in 1950. So highest was Norway at 72, that's green at the top. And you can see India 35, China 43, Russia 55, most of Africa 30-something. And if we go to 2015, look at the improvement, look at the green, that's all in the 70s, wonderful. This is slightly out of date, life expectancy in India is above 70 now. This is terrific. And in South America, 75. We're doing really well. Iran, 76. Great. And Africa is improving a lot. There's a lot of the getting into the 60s now, and it's improving fast. So this sort of steady good news doesn't make the news, does it? They report on disasters, but things that have steadily got better, we just don't hear about. Let's look at where we are today. This is deaths in England in the last 20 years. And there's some really good news here as well. So look at the bottom. This is the number one cause of death, which is a heart attack. And look how it's fallen from the year 2000 to 2019. The death rate from heart disease is just about halved. This is death rate, this is just your chances of dying from a particular cause. Stroke as well. Death rate from stroke has halved. Lower respiratory infections has fallen a bit. This is mostly due to giving up smoking, actually, which is in steep decline, which is a good thing. Smoking life expectancy is 6 to 8 years off your life expectancy if you smoke. For these reasons. Cancer's kind of steady. Medicine is improving. We're getting better chemotherapy, learning how to treat it, diagnose it, and so on. But if you're not dying from heart disease, then you live a bit longer, and then you tend to get cancer. But the worrying one is the one at the top, right? This is dementia, and this is what I do work on. I'm trying to diagnose dementia earlier and invent drugs, and you can see why. Look at it. It's rocketing, and Alzheimer's and other dementia is now the number one cause of death for women in this country, and it's number 2 for men because it's going up so quickly because it's strongly linked to aging, and we have no cure. There's nothing we can do to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and so if you're not having a stroke or heart disease, or you're not smoking, getting through cancer or something like that, then it's quite likely that you'll get dementia when you're 80 or 85 or something like that. And this is a massive public health concern, of course, and this is by far the most expensive disease in the world. So to be brutal, heart disease doesn't cost the NHS so much because it's quick, right? But if you have dementia, then you need care in a nursing home for 10 years. This is extremely expensive. And over 1% of our GDP is going on this at the moment. It's going up fast. Plus effects like people having to quit their jobs to look after their parents and so on and so on. And it's misery. Anyway, that's where we are right now. And as I say, the whole world is not that dissimilar to this picture anymore. Right, what about the future? Highest life expectancy in the world is Japan, 88 for women, 82 for men. So this is achievable, right? So if we just do what they do in Japan, they have a good diet, right? They have an excellent healthcare system, then we could all have life expectancy like Japan, right? That's absolutely achievable. But can we beat this? You know, I do scientific research, this is what I think about, and you know, the easiest way to make a fool of yourself is make predictions, but putting that to one side, let's have a go. So I'll just tell you about a couple of things that are going on to do with current scientific research, and this is stuff that is all, the technology is here really, and we've got the basic science that it works, and it's all about bringing it in and implementing it and things like this. So the first thing that we should do is use data from our bodies for earlier diagnosis and personalised treatments, right? So if you've got like, you know, a Fitbit or a Garmin or something like that, this is a basic way of doing this. And it tracks stuff to do with your body, like your heart rate and whether you're active and stuff like this. We can get far more information. If we routinely took samples from blood or urine or breath and just looked at all the levels of all the chemicals in these fluids, we can get an enormous amount of information about the state of our bodies. We should sequence the DNA of everybody. This will happen routinely. A new baby will have their DNA sequenced. Well, we can do this before babies are born. You can do it to a fetus. So if a baby's going to be born with a genetic health problem, they'll know before they're born and they can be ready. So this is going to happen, right? So what we want to do, we don't want to diagnose disease by symptoms and because you're ill. We want to spot, you know, you're getting pancreatic cancer because we can see the levels of these chemicals are changing in your blood, right? You're not sick yet at all, but we can tell you just started on that pathway, and then you can get in and deal with it. This is what we want to do. And artificial intelligence, this simply means we've got a huge amount of data here, loads and loads of numbers, and you give it to a computer to figure out the best way to deal with all this data and start making diagnosis and things like this. Personalised treatments means we're all different, and we all have different types of cancer because we've got different mutations, and our DNA is all different unless you're an identical twin. So all different treatments will be suitable for different people. We won't just say, you've got pancreatic cancer, and this is how we deal with pancreatic cancer. We'll say, the type of mutation that you've got and the nature of your tumour means this is the best therapy for you. And this will all happen. And it's not particularly expensive, tracking, you know, having all this data from watches and things and feeding it to a computer. And your doctors will just get alerted. Your GP will call you in and say, you know, we're worried about this. Let's follow it up. Something else we will do is grow replacement organs from our own stem cells. So lots of people are waiting for transplants for kidneys and livers and things like this. What we'll do is take cells from our skin, add chemicals that will turn them into stem cells, add other chemicals that will turn these stem cells into particular organs. So you can grow new kidney cells, new liver cells, whatever you need. You can use a 3D printer. Instead of printing plastic, we'll be printing with different cell types. Well, you'll do a scan of your organ and you'll make a mold so it's exactly the right shape of organ that you need, and then print out the layers of cells to give you a new kidney, and there it is. The other thing we'll do is our DNA is we're all descended from a fertilized egg, and the DNA in that fertilized egg went into every cell in your body. And it's a compromise because certain DNA sequences will be good for your liver and other DNA sequences will be better for your lungs. Well, if you get your own stem cells and grow your own organs, you can optimize that organ, right? You can play around with the DNA from that stem cell and make the best possible lung tissue. So the organs that you get will be better than the ones you were born with. Maybe it'll even be routine to go in and have an operation and swap all your organs out. This doesn't work for your brain. Still, you know, we can have super healthy bodies with demented brains, and this is the big... Something else we should do, and this makes me angry, is that we've only ever eradicated 2 diseases. One was smallpox in 1979, where we vaccinated everybody on the planet. And one was rinderpest, a disease of cows, where we vaccinated every cow. And those diseases are gone forever because they're only in humans. We can't get rid of plague because plague lives in mice, right? And we can't vaccinate every mouse. But these diseases here are only in people. And we have invented an excellent vaccine for measles in the 1960s, and it's a disgrace that this disease is still around. We need to vaccinate everybody on the planet, and then measles will go forever, right? And there are others like this, polio, mumps, rubella, and so on. Some of these other diseases are caused by parasites like guinea worm and hookworm and things like this. And if you provide clean water for everybody on the planet, these parasites will die and they'll be gone forever because they need humans as part of their life cycle. And we should do this. So the problem here, you might think the reason we can't, what we're waiting for is scientists to come up with cures, and sometimes that just isn't true. The scientists have done their job. We've got cures for all these things, and it's our failings of all of us and our leaders and so on to implement them across the whole world and wipe out diseases forever. And part of this is the curse of national boundaries. So infectious microorganisms don't care about imaginary lines on a map, and it's a false economy to wipe out disease in one country if it's raging in a border, just across the river. It will come back, right? So, COVID, we need to vaccinate everybody in the world, don't we? Otherwise, it will just come back. But that's not the way things work. So only treating disease in your own country is a false economy. You need politicians and leaders and healthcare people need to blow the whistles, like with famine. So I've got a problem here. We've had a bad, terrible harvest. Or looks like we've got new disease here. I'm seriously worried about this. Hold your hand up, say we've got a problem. And then people should come in across the entire planet and deal with it and invent vaccines as quickly as possible that we can all use and so on and so on. So disease prevention, control and eradication must be a worldwide effort. If we do these things, let's go a couple of years beyond Japan and get to a life expectancy of 90. I don't see why not. And the other thing I would say is that this dropping fertility rate is a good thing, and steady population decline may help us avoid environmental catastrophe. So that's some good news to end on. And finally, a blatant plug. This is, if you're interested in this stuff, that's the book. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So I think we've got a handful of minutes for some questions for Andrew, but I just want to say, fantastic. Having read your book, I did wonder how we were going to get from the Paleolithic right the way up to the present day, but you've done it, and actually some hope in there as well.
Well, I did it by leaving a lot of stuff out.
Which is why you need to read the book. So, is there anybody who's got a question? We've got a hand straight up here. Have we got a lollipop mic or anything? There we go. If you just wait till the mic comes to you, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks so much. Andrew, excellent talk. Thank you very much. How far can we go in terms of extending life expectancy, do you think? I mean, we seem to be making enormous progress in the treatment of cancers, and I think also starting to get to grips with things like Alzheimer's. Do you think there's going to be a barrier in the future beyond which we really cannot go, or is this going to be a continuing process?
Unless we do, there may be some kind of radical leap forward in technology, that's always possible. But looking at where we are now, I think there is an upper limit, and we can tell what that upper limit is by looking at the people who live the longest. These supercentenarians who live to the age of 110, and they don't get any of these diseases. They're still mentally, people who are 110, they're frail, but they don't have dementia, and they have superb immune systems, and they don't have heart problems. And ultimately, they fail to maintain a homeostasis. Their brain loses the ability to keep their organs functioning. And I think that'd be like, if you defeat all these diseases, like if we cure cancer and dementia and all infectious disease and be able to do heart transplants at will, you'll run into this homeostasis issue, and ultimately your brain will lose the ability to maintain function. And I think that might be that will be over 100. So I think there is an upper limit, unless we do something really radical that we don't know about yet.
Thank you, great question. We've got a hand right at the back in the middle. Are we able to go back that far? You're going to get your steps in today, running up all of this. I think there are a couple of hands right in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering what, in your personal opinion, has been the greatest leap forward in terms of extending life expectancy? Of all the ones that you've listed, what do you think gave us the most as a species?
Germ theory. The realization that disease is spread by infectious microorganisms, typically bacteria and viruses. Because once we realized what's actually causing disease, then you can look for ways to deal with it. Right? And that was only about 1870, 1880. That was the most important advance I think we ever had. And then we realized, you know, disease, once you found the cause of disease, then you can try and kill the things that's doing it. And, you know, maybe they're living in infected water, or maybe we could have a drug that will kill this thing. You know, or, you know, realizing that malaria is spread by mosquitoes. Once you realize that, then you can start killing the mosquitoes, right? And this was, late 19th century was the biggest advance in, and that's why we started inventing drugs. That's why we started searching for chemicals that would kill germs, but you can't do that until you realize it's the germs that are the problem, right? So I think that's the best ever idea that we had. People like Robert Koch in Germany and Louis Pasteur in France, like main people in doing this.
Thank you. We've got more hands at the back. They're going up the fastest. I think we've got a couple of questions there.
Thank you. As you look back in history and see the reaction that people have to new ideas, to what degree, in your opinion, do you think that civil liberties will prevent progress? You know, things like vaccine and DNA, the use of DNA.
Yeah, so anti-vaccine movement is as old as vaccination itself. So the first vaccine was taking cowpox, this mild disease, to prevent smallpox. And there was bitter opposition to this even throughout the 19th century. It's a really tricky one. I think anti-vaxxers are wrong. Vaccines can cause some health issues, but the benefits of them are absolutely colossal, right? And as I said, it makes me angry that we haven't been able to wipe out polio. But how do you do it? Do you really want to make it absolutely compulsory? Do you want to physically pin somebody down and stick a needle in them if they're insisting that they don't want it? Oh, I don't know. And then I know what we should do, but how do you change people's minds? I don't know the answer, but that is one of the problems, yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got another hand just by the ladies after the question there. Thank you.
I thought it was a very interesting talk, thank you. I was staggered by the rate of increase in dementia deaths. Do you think that can just be attributed to the fact that people are living longer and not dying of other things, or is there more at play here?
It's not just living longer. Part of it is increased diagnosis, recognising this. Doctors are more likely. So if you go back 50 years, if you go, Alzheimer himself reported this disease from one patient in about the year 1910, and he reported this at a conference in Germany. And then 5 years later, all his colleagues came back, and some of them said, you know, I had some Alzheimer's patients as well. And in all of Germany, in 5 years, they had about 10 patients. It was just not, it was thought to be a normal part of aging. Going senile, just thought to be normal. And now we accept it is not normal and it shouldn't happen. Because most people don't get dementia, right? Most people are fine. And it's something pathological. It's an illness, it's an abnormal. And recognising that, people are more likely to make the diagnosis. So that's part of it as well, yeah. Is that what you were thinking of? Yeah, that makes a lot of this data very difficult in, you know, I'm obviously interested in epidemiology and how diseases change and things like this, but a lot of it is changing definitions and willingness of doctors or pathologists or coroners to assign a cause of death. I mean, the most obvious example of this is suicide statistics, which are extremely inaccurate and vary enormously from country to country, and that's probably just a willingness of people to say this was a death by suicide or not, with things like that, where there's a lot of stigma like that.
We've got time for one more question, so it's first. Now, I have to say, as I saw this sea of hands, there's a hand here that went up first. It caught my eye, so this is going to be the last question. Is that right? If we just wait for the lollipop mic.
Oh no, my question's depressing.
We'll try and, cheer up after that bit.
Not to mar the hopeful tone, but I was wondering, you were talking about how life expectancy is growing, but is there information that sort of pulls against that? Like, for example, I read that life expectancy was coming down in Britain, for example, possibly as a result of austerity. Has coronavirus had an impact? And say diseases that can resist antibiotics, that sort of thing. Is there a downside? Sorry to not be hopeful.
No, you're right, and I skimmed over this and I said I was taking the very long-term, broad picture. Life expectancy is falling in this country in the last year or two because of those reasons, COVID and austerity and struggles the NHS are going through and things like that. Yep, that's true. There'll always be blips. We will always have new diseases. The influenza virus is always mutating, and there'll be new strains will appear and things like this. And that's the noise in these life expectancy curves. They tend to be bad, but don't last very long. So there's a sudden dip, and then it comes back up again. And antibiotic resistance. Yeah, of course, that's a worry. We know how to deal with antibiotic resistance. Again, we get the entire world together and we just say here's 20 antibiotics, and nobody on the entire planet is ever going to take one of these 10 antibiotics for the next 20 years. Then resistance to all those would disappear. And if you banned the use of particular antibiotics for long periods of time and stepped through these, then all the resistance would vanish to that antibiotic, and then you could bring it back. But we can't do this. You can go to a chemist's in China and you don't need a prescription. You can just buy any antibiotic off the shelf. So they just dish them around. And we give them to farm animals that aren't even sick. We just give them just as a preventative measure to make the cows grow faster. And if you want a way to develop resistance to antibiotics, that's the way to go. And so we do stupid things. Is a worry, but we could deal with it. We just need to get organised. It's difficult. It's difficult for doctors as well, because they would be in a position where they say, I know that this antibiotic is the best thing for your particular condition, and I'm not going to give it to you. And doctors are swear on oath not to do things like that. So it's a tricky thing. For the greater good of all of mankind, we should stop using many antibiotics and save them up and bring them back. Anyway.
Thank you.
A brilliant last question. I hope you'd all like to join me in just saying thank you so much to Andrew for a riveting talk.